Welcome to 3:15 o'clock, that very channel where the unspoken becomes unforgettable. Do you have the courage to explore the stories they always wanted to hide from you? This is not just a horror channel. This is a place where silence is shattered by secrets, and every story carries a weight of fear it was never meant to bear. The first story. Caroline O'Neill knew isolation. She knew cold, but no training, no textbook had prepared her for the 6 months of night at Crystal Station. Crystal was nothing more than a battered metal container, hammered into a snow-covered gravel mound at the foot of the Triple Tooth Glacier. This glacier was her mission. Her job was to monitor its movement, composition, and melting speed. It was noble, yet incredibly monotonous work she'd been doing for 5 months. Her only companions were Jack, the satellite communications operator in Fairbanks, who would check in precisely at 10:122:19 to hear her report of zero change and relay zero news. Mo, the little silence, an old, cast-iron stove that hummed and crackled with limited success. The white noise, the background, ubiquitous soundtrack of her life, consisting of cracking ice, howling wind, and the constant static of the idle radio. The days merged into one endless gray twilight cycle. Caroline felt her mind beginning to freeze along with the landscape. She started talking to the pressure gauges, giving names to her seismographs. She knew it was normal. This was Alaska. This was winter isolation. At night, lying in her sleeping bag, she listened to the symphony of ice. It was a majestic, terrifying orchestra. Deep, guttural moans of shifting masses, the piercing shriek of micro-fissures, the low rumble of subglacial streams. She had learned to distinguish them, like music. Everything changed on the Wednesday of stagnation. She named it herself because on that day there was no wind, no snow. Perfect glass-like silence, as if the world had held its breath. She was sitting at her desk, logging data, when she heard it. A scrape. It wasn't loud, but it was utterly unnatural for a glacier. Not a groan, not a crack. It was a rhythmic, dragging sound, like a boot shuffling across packed snow. Caroline froze. Her pen suspended over the notebook. Scrape, scrape. It was coming from inside the Triple Tooth Glacier, seemingly only 10 meters from the wall of her station. She jumped up, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and went outside. The cold slapped her face, but she didn't notice it. She stood at the base of the massive blue ice, shining her light on it. Smooth, dead, eternal. She stood there for 5 minutes, shivering from the cold, not from fear. Silence. Ice shift, she whispered, trying to convince herself. Acoustic effect. A glacier is a giant resonator. Maybe a piece of rock fell into a crevasse and the sound just... She didn't finish the thought. It wasn't resonance. It was rhythm. She went back inside, but sleep had fled. All night she listened to the symphony of ice, and now a dissonance had entered it. Over the next 2 nights, the scrape repeated. It started exactly at 1 in the morning and lasted about 20 minutes. Caroline stopped sleeping. She sat by the radio, ready if not to flee, then at least to report it. But what would she say? Jack, I think someone is shuffling their feet inside my ice mountain. Send a psychiatrist? On the 4th night, she took a portable seismograph. It was a sensitive instrument designed to register the smallest ground tremors. She took it outside, buried it in the snow near the glacier, and started recording. The next morning, reviewing the data, she found what she feared on the graph. Amidst the static and noise was a clear sequence of low-frequency vibrations. They were too rhythmic for a natural ice shift, too regular for a rockfall. It was a track, the track of something that was moving. That night the scrape changed. It became louder, closer, and something human entered its rhythm. Before, it was scrape, 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 monotonous. Now it was Scrape, grind, scrape, 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 pause, grind. It was as if the shuffler hesitated, stumbled, and then sped up. It was moving. It was getting closer. Caroline could no longer rationalize. She knew the structure of the Triple-Tooth Glacier better than the back of her hand. There were no caves, no tunnels. It was monolithic ice, hundreds of meters deep. Whatever it was, it had been entombed in the ice, and now it was getting out. The isolation, which had been a professional risk, became a prison. The ice, which was the object of her study, became the walls hiding a horror. She tried to contact Jack off schedule. The radio yielded only crackle and static. On a normal Alaskan day, this wasn't rare, but now it felt like a punch to the gut. She was cut off. By the 7th day, Caroline could barely stand. Sleep deprivation, terror, and the constant cold that seemed to penetrate her very bones made her brittle. She spent the entire day frantically reviewing all the old reports for Crystal. Not a single mention of strange sounds. Nothing but routine data. She only found one oddity. In the old, brittle reports from the 1970s, there were several manually erased pages and a mention of Project Depth 13, which had been abruptly terminated. The reason was not specified. In the evening, as the darkness thickened, Caroline grabbed a pickaxe. She had to see. She had to check. With the powerful flashlight in hand, she returned to the glacier. She illuminated the section from where, by her calculations, the sound was coming. Nothing. Smooth, blue surface. She started striking. The dull, heavy thud of the pickaxe against the eternal ice. Bam! 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 She hit until she was exhausted, until the icy air burned in her lungs. She had only managed to chip a small indentation, and then she heard the answer. It was instantaneous. As if the strike of her pickaxe was a signal. Grind, grind, scrape! Now the sound was incredibly close. It wasn't just shuffling. It was digging. Caroline staggered back. Her eyes frantically scanned the glacier. And then, in the light of her flashlight, she saw it. About 2 meters from the ground, on the perfectly smooth surface, a spot appeared. It was no bigger than a coin, but it was darker than the surrounding ice. It looked like water, or... She brought the flashlight closer. The spot was pink, no, red. It was blood, Caroline screamed. From the horror, from the realization that something alive was entombed in this centuries-old ice. Something that was bleeding and clawing its way out to freedom. Isolation, once a concept, was now a monster. The ice, once her subject, was its shell. She ran back to the station, slammed the door and barricaded it with everything she could. Fuel barrels, supply crates. It was futile, but it was an action. All night, Caroline sat by the radio waiting for the 10 o'clock communication with Jack. The scrape and the grind became constant. They merged into a monotonous, wet, slopping sound, punctuated by blows, as if something was pounding through the ice with its knuckles. She stared out the window. The glacier was no longer just blue. It was streaked with red veins. A network of micro-fissures, filled with something dark, spread from the center, the place where she'd seen the first spot. She turned on all the heaters. She turned on the lights, but the cold was inside her. It was in the sounds. Exactly at 22E, the radio came alive. Crystal, Crystal, this is Fairbanks, over. Caroline, how are things?
Zero report.
Over. Jack's voice was salvation. Caroline snatched the microphone, her voice hoarse like old paper. Jack, listen to me. There's something here. In the glacier. It's coming out. I see blood. I hear it digging. The station is compromised. I need evacuation. Immediately. Over. A long pause followed, filled with the wet, slopping sound from outside. Caroline. Blood? Are you sure you're okay, Car? We saw your sleep schedule. Extremely erratic. This must be hypothermia and isolation anxiety. You just need to sleep. You're working with a glacier. Ice shifts are normal. Over. His words were a slap. They didn't believe her. Jack, you don't understand. I just saw. It's breaking through the ice. I know what an ice shift sounds like. This isn't ice. This is something else, please. Ask about depth 13. Ask about the abandoned project. Over. Caroline, I can request an evacuation, but it will take at least 3 days with the weather, and you know that. You need to stay calm. Just sleep. We'll talk in the morning. Out. Out. Caroline put the microphone down. Her hands were shaking. She was completely alone with the thing in the ice. She looked out the window. The dark spot on the glacier was now the size of a football, and it was moving. It was pulsating. It was an eye in the blue mass. She grabbed the shotgun, leaning against the wall. Her only defense against bears. Suddenly the grind stopped. Perfect silence. The same glass-like silence as on that very first day. She looked out the window. It was standing there, not outside, inside the ice. A vague, unnaturally tall shadow frozen in the mass of blue ice directly opposite her window. The shadow was too thin, too long to be human. It was contorted at a strange angle, as if its joints were broken. But the most terrifying thing, Caroline couldn't distinguish any features. The shadow was flat, two-dimensional, as if a person's soul were trapped in the eternal cold, while the body remained elsewhere. She raised the shotgun, aimed, but she knew shooting was useless. The ice was too thick, and then the shadow moved. It didn't shift. It slid across the ice like an oil slick, moving slowly but purposefully, remaining inside the glacier but approaching the station. The scrape returned. But now it wasn't digging. It was a shuffling sound on the ice, the exact sound she'd heard on the first night. Scrape, scrape. It rounded the corner of the glacier and was right next to the station wall, behind which Caroline was sitting. She heard a new sound. It was the sound of metal grating against ice. A thin, high vibrating sound, as if something very sharp was scraping the ice shell, and the sound was being transmitted directly into the concrete foundation. Caroline fell to the floor, covering her ears. "It's coming out. It's coming out," she whispered. The radio. The radio was on the table. She had to. She crawled to the radio, grabbed the microphone, but before she could press the button, the scrape stopped. Silence fell. The most dreadful silence she had ever known. From a distance, somewhere beyond the glacier, a moan echoed. Low, prolonged human moan. Then, a crack. Caroline lifted her head. The crack was not on the glacier. It was beneath her. She looked at the floor. The metal floor plate, which was welded to the beams, lifted a millimeter. From beneath the seam where the floor met the wall, a thin, damp pink tendril extended. It looked like a long, curved finger covered in a transparent, icy glaze. It was trembling, then a second, and a third. They wrapped around the beam holding up the stove. A scream lodged in Caroline's throat. This thing had emerged from inside the glacier, gone underneath it, and was now climbing out from beneath the ground, right into her warm, lit, fragile station. A terrifying realization shot through her body. It had come for the warmth. For her warmth, the stove trembled. The beam wrapped by the tendrils began to creak. Caroline, frantic with horror, scrambled up, holding the shotgun. She could try to shoot the floor, but that would blow up the whole fuel tank. She could run. She bolted for the back door, leading to the storage room. She yanked it open, stumbling inside. In the storage room, cluttered with crates, she grabbed the emergency beacon. She pressed the button, activating an alert that would go directly to a military base up north. At that very moment, the storage room wall, adjacent to the glacier, exploded. Not with ice, with cold. In the opening, in the oily black darkness, stood the shadow. It was no longer flat. It was three-dimensional, but still unnaturally thin and tall. Its limbs were covered in a transparent crust of ice, beneath which a red, moist flesh could be faintly discerned. Its head was turned. It had multiple mouths, stacked one above the other like fissures in an ice flow, and each of them emitted its own scrape. Scrape, 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 the shuffling, grind, grind, the breaking through, wet slopping, the feasting. She felt the cold being drawn out of her. Like evaporation, Caroline raised the shotgun, aimed for the chest. Instead of a shot, she heard a voice in her mind. We waited. In it, you are warmth to us. We are hungry. 70 years. She pulled the trigger. Boom! The shotgun fired, but the slug hit the thick, transparent carapace and ricocheted with a repulsive, glassy clang. The creature laughed. The sound was like ice cracking on teeth. It lifted its icy hand. Its fingers were long spikes, and it punctured the remains of the wall with them, grabbing the edge. Caroline dropped the shotgun. She stared into the horror, and the last thought that flashed through her mind was, Jack was right. I shouldn't have gone crazy. The creature entered the room. The cold was so intense that her lungs instantly spasmed. She couldn't scream into the radio. The next morning, when the rescue helicopter arrived following the beacon signal, they found Crystal Station intact, but barricaded from the inside. Inside, they found the shotgun, the radio turned off, and Caroline's notebook. The last entry, scrape. Caroline O'Neill had vanished. The only oddity, in the center of the room, right on the metal floor, was a perfectly smooth, gleaming piece of ice, unnaturally transparent. When it was lifted, there was a round dent in the metal, as if something extremely heavy had been pressing on that spot from beneath the floor. From a distance, from the mass of the Triple-Tooth Glacier came a faint scrape, which the pilot dismissed as the sound of the ice shifting. Operation Depth 13 remained a secret, and the Triple-Tooth Glacier continues its slow, eternal march toward the sea, carrying its frozen secret within. The second story, Jake McKay loved the Alaskan sky. Not the tourist-friendly, sun-kissed sky, but the real one, wild, temperamental, stretched over millions of square miles of untouched wilderness. He was a postman, one of the few who delivered vital cargo to the most remote settlements, places where ordinary people never set foot. His old but trusty, single-engine Beaver was an extension of himself, ramshackle, creaky, but hellishly resilient. This flight was routine. Anchorage to Old Harbor, a 3-hour journey over a green and white blanket of taiga. Old Harbor was 10 houses, a post office, and a fur shop. Nothing special. But Alaska doesn't tolerate routine. Mid-flight, just as Jake was anticipating hot coffee and a salmon sandwich, the sky changed. The sky didn't just darken, it vanished, as if a gigantic white hand had covered the entire world. The snowstorm hit so suddenly with such ferocity that his Beaver was tossed around like a child's toy. The instruments danced wildly and the radio choked on static. Damn it, damn it! Jake yelled into the microphone, which was already useless. He wrestled the yoke like a wild animal trying to maintain control. Visibility was zero. The white curtain enveloped everything, erasing the horizon, the ground, and the sky into one single, hostile mass. The last thing he remembered was a jarring impact, the screech of metal against wood, and then absolute silence. A silence that was louder than any roar. He woke up, strapped into his seat. The plane's nose was crumpled, a wing torn off. But Jake was intact. A few bruises, a bruised head, but nothing serious. He unbuckled and climbed out of the cockpit. Around him stretched an absolute white void. Snow fell in thick flakes, muffling all sound. Pines stood in a solid wall, their branches bowing under the snow's weight. No wind, no movement. Just a white, dead landscape. His radio was smashed. The GPS was dead. The compass, miraculously, had survived. South. He had to go south. Somewhere beyond this endless whiteness, there was civilization. Somewhere, Jake grabbed his pack from the emergency kit, spare batteries, a knife, matches, some dried meat, and a canteen of water. He could feel the cold starting to set in. He took his first step. The crunch of snow beneath his boot was the only sound. He walked, slowly, cautiously, sinking into the deep snow. The compass in his hand was the only thread tethering him to reality. After several hours, Jake started to feel exhaustion. He decided to measure his path. His strides were long, measured. He counted them. 1,762 steps, roughly a kilometer. That's how he calculated distances when the GPS failed. He found a marker, a fallen tree, its roots sticking out of the snow like giant tentacles. He broke off a small branch and laid it on the downed trunk. Marker number 1, he muttered aloud, just to hear his own voice. He continued his trek south. Another 1,762 steps. After covering the calculated kilometer, Jake started looking for a new marker. He scanned the area but found nothing remarkable. Going further without marking a spot would be a mistake. He could already feel himself becoming disoriented, and then he saw it. His heart dropped. The fallen tree, its roots sticking out of the snow like giant tentacles, and on its downed trunk lay a broken branch. His marker number 1. Jake froze. The cold pierced right through him. He had definitely walked south. The compass was in his hand. The needle pointed true. He had walked exactly 1 kilometer. Impossible, he whispered. He went back to the tree, bent down, touched the branch. It was the one. He recognized it. He repeated the path again, counting every step, reaching 1,762. He was certain, absolutely certain he was walking straight, and he ended up back at the fallen tree. Panic began to creep up on him like a predator. His mind clung to logic, but there was no logic. He tried to rationalize. Perhaps a strong magnetic anomaly. Perhaps his compass was broken. But the needle was steady. He started to run, running south without looking back. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs were numb. He ran, convinced he would break this damned circle. When he finally stopped, gasping for air, his gaze fell upon the fallen tree. He was right where he had started. The woods around him were identical, the same pines, the same snowdrifts. Jake fell to his knees, his head swimming. This was impossible. He was trapped in an invisible kilometer, a circle exactly 1 kilometer in diameter, with no way to reach its edge. The first night passed in a state of stupor. Jake built a small shelter of branches and snow beneath the fallen tree. He tried to sleep, but every rustle sounded like footsteps. Footsteps of something else that was also trapped in this kilometer-wide loop. He ate some dried meat. Water was scarce. His mind refused to accept the absurdity of what was happening. In the morning, he tried again. This time, he didn't count his steps. He just walked south, following the compass. For hours, the forest around him was strange. It didn't change. Every tree, every snowdrift seemed familiar, as if he had seen them many times before. And then he started noticing shifts. That pine tree, the one he distinctly remembered having a cracked trunk, was now whole. And the one that was whole now had a crack. Small, barely noticeable changes that his exhausted brain tried to dismiss as hallucinations, but they became more and more apparent. He saw his own tracks. Fresh tracks he'd left an hour ago, walking towards him. He lowered his head to look at his boots, then raised it again. The tracks were now walking parallel to him. The forest began to bend. He saw it. When he looked straight ahead, the trees lined up in a perfect straight line. But when he shifted his gaze to the periphery, he saw the trunks deviate, the branches warp, as if trying to create an invisible wall around him. As if the forest itself was a living mechanism that was coiling around him. Jake screamed. He screamed until his voice gave out, until he felt the pain tearing his throat. But his cries dissolved in the white silence, finding no echo. Despair was palpable. He realized that the forest wasn't bending. Space was bending. Reality around him was warped. He was at the center of some temporal or spatial anomaly. He laid out his belongings in the snow. The knife, the matches, the canteen, the remaining meat. He did it specifically to see if they would stay put. When he completed the loop and returned to the fallen tree, all his things were still there. They hadn't moved an inch, and they were already covered with a thin layer of fresh snow, even though it hadn't snowed for hours. Time, too, was distorted. On the second day, he stopped running. He just stood by the fallen tree, watching his own track coming from the north and meeting him from the south, as if he were moving in two directions at once, or his path was so warped that it closed in on itself. His mind began to surrender. By the third day, Jake was on the brink. The cold seeped into every cell of his body. Hunger burned within. But the worst was the whispering of the branches. At first he thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. Then he decided they were voices in his head caused by delirium. But the whisper was too distinct. It emanated from the pines themselves. Not words, but a muttering. Low, resonant, as if hundreds of voices were murmuring something in an incomprehensible, constantly shifting, intertwining language. Shh, shh, shh. The whisper was everywhere. It seemed threatening, yet at the same time inviting. Jake raised his head. He saw the tree branches slowly bending, as if in a silent dance, reacting to the invisible sounds. They leaned towards him, then recoiled, then leaned again, creating the sensation that the forest was watching him. He tried to speak to the forest. What? What do you want? His voice was raspy, the whisper intensified. It became almost audible. He thought he made out words. Lost. Lonely. Come to us. The forest was alive. Not just alive, but conscious. And he was in its trap. He noticed other tracks in the snow. They were old, almost frozen over, but not his. They were the tracks of bare feet. Numerous tracks, and they too walked in circles, intersecting with his own, but always disappearing before he could follow them to an end. Other people. They had been here too, trapped in this kilometer. Suddenly the whisper stopped. Absolute silence, and it was even more terrifying. Jake looked up. Far ahead, where the forest should have been uniform, he saw a clearing. In it stood a house, a small, dilapidated log cabin with a thin plume of smoke curling from its chimney. Hope. He lunged toward the house, ran as fast as his frost-bitten legs would carry him. He felt his strength leaving him, but the image of the house, the smoke, the warmth, spurred him forward. He ran. He ran, and then he stopped. Before him was the fallen tree, his marker number 1, and the house was gone. The forest had closed in again, forming a continuous wall of pines and snow. Jake collapsed. His mind shattered. The house was a hallucination, a tempting mirage created by the forest to play with him. He felt a touch, gentle, almost weightless. On his cheek he looked up. A pine branch was bent over him. One of them, thin and coated with hoarfrost, was gently stroking his face, and from that branch came the whisper. No longer a murmur, but one clear word. Stay. Jake didn't resist. He felt the cold envelop him as the branches began to intertwine around him, making him a part of this eternally bending forest. His body began to freeze, but there was no fear, only exhaustion and peace. The forest slowly consumed him. His eyes closed. The rescue operation, launched a week after Jake McKay failed to check in, was short-lived. Helicopter crews flew over the presumed crash site, but found no traces. That week's snowstorm had been particularly fierce, and the beaver's wreckage was likely fully buried. He was presumed dead. But occasionally, especially during the deepest winters, when hunters or lost tourists ventured too far into that part of the taiga, they told strange stories. One hunter, who had lost his GPS, swore he got lost in a strange circle he couldn't break out of, no matter how far he walked. He saw unusual markers that repeated and then vanished. Another, passing through the same area, spoke of a quiet whisper coming from the trees, which seemed to know his name. And once, a group of survivalists, having gotten lost, discovered an old, almost snow-covered track. It was the track of bare feet which led to a fallen tree. Where the track ended, they found one, perfectly preserved backpack with dried meat and a canteen that was full but unfrozen. Resting on the backpack was an old compass, its needle spinning in a circle, as if searching for a non-existent pole. Sometimes, on the quietest nights when there is no wind and the snow lies motionless, a faint, rhythmic scrape can be heard coming from that part of the taiga, as if someone is shuffling a boot on the snow. Sometimes, if you stare long enough into the endless whiteness, you can see the forest slowly bending, forming a perfect, invisible circle. And somewhere in the center of that circle, the forest still whispers, calling to the lost, and perhaps waiting for the next postman. The kilometer of oblivion is alive, and it is still hungry. The third story. The Anderson family was looking for a fresh start. James, a software engineer laid off after a crisis, and Sarah, an artist whose inspiration had dried up in noisy Seattle. They chose Juneau, Alaska, a city surrounded by glaciers, mountains, and the mystical, perpetually gray fjord. They bought an old, gloomy house built in the 1920s that James dubbed a ship in dry dock. The house stood on a bluff, offering a spectacular but damp view of the icy water. Externally, it looked solid, clad in dark shingle, but inside, it felt like a museum of other people's lives. Their son, Timmy, who was just 6, behaved strangely from the start. He was a quiet, thoughtful child, but in the new house he became wary. He avoided corridors without windows and often stared at the corners of rooms, as if expecting something. James and Sarah chalked it up to the stress of moving. The only obvious oddity in the house they discovered during the first week was a mirror in the basement. The basement was low, damp, with a dirt floor and cobwebs that seemed thicker than ropes. In the corner where 2 load-bearing walls met, an antique, heavy mirror in a frame of dark blackened wood was nailed to the wall. It was secured with 3 thick, rusty nails, as if the owners feared it might fall. And the strangest thing was its placement. The mirror didn't reflect a door, stairs, or a window, but an empty corner of the opposite wall. Why? Sarah wondered, running her hand over the dusty surface. What did they want to see? Dirt? James shrugged. Old Alaska. Maybe it's some kind of charm. A mirror to catch evil in the corner. They decided to leave it. After all, it was just the basement. On the 3rd evening after the move, as Sarah was tucking Timmy into bed, the boy suddenly sat up, his eyes wide open. "Mom," he whispered. "The man is watching." "Who, dear? Daddy?" "He's downstairs." "No, the man in the wall. The cold one. He's looking at me from over there." Timmy pointed to the wall behind the dresser. Sarah hugged him, soothing him. She immediately told James about it. "Here we go." James sighed. Moving fantasies. Cut off his ghost cartoons, but Timmy's behavior only worsened. Over the next few days, he refused to go downstairs unsupervised. He started wetting the bed. He constantly talked about the man in the wall who doesn't move and is waiting. One day, during dinner, Timmy suddenly screamed, looking at Sarah's reflection in the window pane. "He's with you. He's standing right behind you. He's cold." James grabbed his son, and Sarah, turning around, saw only her own frightened reflection against the backdrop of gloomy trees. That same night, James couldn't sleep. He thought about Timmy's words and the strange mirror in the basement. What if the mirror wasn't there by accident? What if it reflected not an empty corner, but something that was meant to stay hidden? In the morning, he went down to the basement. His gaze immediately fell upon the mirror. It was as dark, as nailed to the wall as ever. But James thought the mirror's surface was damp, as if covered with the thinnest film of dew, even though the basement was dry. James made a decision. If this mirror was causing Timmy's fears, it had to be destroyed. He grabbed his tools. James had to use incredible force. The nails were thick and rusted solid. When he finally wrenched out the last one, the mirror fell with a heavy thud onto the dirt floor of the basement, shattering an old, mold-covered tile. Instead of a smooth wall behind the mirror, James saw darkness. It was a cavity, a small but deep opening, just large enough for a person to stand inside. The cavity was cut right into the house's foundation, between two concrete blocks, and was perfectly rectangular, exactly matching the size of the mirror. James felt a sheet of ice-cold sweat run down his spine. He shined his flashlight inside. The space was tiny, about 50 centimeters deep, 70 wide, and seemed to extend upwards, almost to the basement ceiling. A wave of indescribable cold wafted out, mixed with a sharp, pungent odor like old sweat and mildew. Inside, there was nothing but dust and cobwebs. James was about to turn away when the beam of the flashlight caught something on the cavity's dirt floor. It was a button. A single dark brown bone button. A button from a coat they had never seen. James climbed out of the basement shaking. Sarah, seeing his pale face, immediately went downstairs. She saw the opening, felt the cold, smelled the odor. She felt dizzy. Why would someone make a crypt in the wall? She whispered. It was a peephole, James murmured. The man in the wall. The one who watched through the mirror. He stood here, and he could see the entire basement. Maybe what was above it, too. They hurried upstairs and quickly fetched planks and a hammer. James boarded up the opening tightly, using the longest nails he could find. Every strike of the hammer echoed in the house's silence, as if nailing shut not only the planks but also the secret. Timmy slept soundly that night. James and Sarah felt immense relief. They talked to their son, telling him the bad man was gone, and the house was now clean, but the peace and quiet didn't last. 2 days later, walking past the spot in the first-floor hallway that was directly above the boarded-up opening in the basement, James felt a cold draft, as if icy air was coming through the walls. The draft was strange. It was narrow and sharp like a prick, and it was immobile. If he stepped a meter aside, the draft vanished. Sarah noticed it too. She ran her hand over the wallpaper at that spot. The wall was cold like a glacier. There's no window or vent here, Sarah said. It's just a wall. James pressed his ear against it. He only heard his own heartbeat. The following week, they started hearing sounds. First, it was a tapping. Quiet, rhythmic tap, 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 tap. Not like a branch, like a fingernail scratching wood, and then a laugh. A quiet, barely discernible dry chuckle. It came from inside the wall, right from the spot where they felt the cold. The laugh was long, exhalatory, as if someone was laughing with their face pressed against the concrete. Sarah wept. He's there. He's still there. We only hit him. James ran his hand over the cold wall. He felt his sanity slowly cracking. He went to the basement to check. The planks were in place, the nails were rusting. He pressed his ear against the boarded-up wall. Silence. He returned upstairs, walked down the corridor. Again the cold draft, and the quiet, dry chuckle. He's not in the basement, James realized. He's in the walls. He's moving. Soon, James discovered that Timmy was drawing again. The boy sat on the floor using thick crayons to outline the same figures repeatedly. The drawings showed the house, but the house was cut in half, and inside the walls were black, vertical, human-like figures. These figures were tall and thin, with empty eyes, and on every figure a single bone button was drawn. One drawing showed the hallway wall, his favorite place to draw. From that wall, thin black lines stretched out, wrapping around the wrists of the sleeping boy in his bed. "What is this, Timmy?" James asked, feeling sick. "It's the man," Timmy replied emotionlessly. "He didn't leave. He walks in the walls. He watches us. He waits for us to fall asleep." "Why does he wait?" "He said he needs a place," the boy whispered. This was the last straw. James decided they had to leave. He started packing. When he entered the master bedroom, he found their wall clock was missing. A heavy, antique clock that hung on the wall above the fireplace. Only 2 rusty hooks remained. Sarah didn't remember taking it down. They searched everywhere. The clock was gone. "It's a thief," James tried to convince himself. "Someone broke in while we slept." But how could a thief break into the house without leaving a trace and only take one heavy antique clock? He looked at where the clock had been. 030. He thought he heard ticking, faint, muffled. It was coming from inside the wall next to the fireplace. James grabbed a crowbar. He started tearing the wall apart. Wallpaper, plaster, wood, everything flew. Sarah watched him in horror. When he reached the studs, he saw a void, the empty space between the beams. And in that space, pressed against the insulation, lay the wall clock. It was lying there, nailed with one spike to the inner side of the drywall, and it was ticking. James pulled the clock out. It was covered in a thin layer of damp earth and mold, as if it had been kept in the basement. He stood in the middle of the ruined living room, holding the clock. "It's not a thief," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It's him. He can't move clocks." James desperately tried to hold on to his sanity. "He can't nail them. It must be the old owner. He was hiding things, but he didn't believe his own words. The man in the wall was real. He was somewhere in those partitions, and he was drawing them in." The next day, James decided to check the entire hallway wall where the cold draft was coming from. He started tapping. Most sections sounded dull and solid, but one spot exactly above the cavity in the basement sounded hollow. James punched a small hole. He looked inside. It was dark, but he saw that the insulation was missing. There was a vertical shaft leading upward. He heard a sound. Not a laugh, not a tap, but a sigh. A deep, damp sigh, as if someone who had been standing too long was finally taking a breath. James recoiled. He covered the hole with a picture. Now, when they walked past that spot, the draft became stronger. It hit the back of their necks, and the laugh became clearer. It was malicious. James himself began to change. He became obsessed with the walls. He tapped them, listened, measured. He stopped sleeping. Timmy, on the other hand, became completely calm. The boy sat and drew, but now his drawings were happy. They showed the house not cut but whole, and in the house there was only one family, the Andersons. The man in the wall was gone, but something was there. Timmy started drawing his father, James. He drew him thin, elongated, with empty eyes, standing behind the wall. Sarah finally understood that they had lost James. He had become part of the house's obsession. One night she woke up to the cold. She looked at the spot next to her. James was gone. She went downstairs holding a flashlight. She found him in the basement. He was standing, bent over the opening he had so meticulously boarded up. He had pulled out all the planks. The opening was wide open. James was staring into the darkness. He was wearing only a thin shirt and his body was shaking from the cold. "James, what are you doing?" Sarah whispered. He didn't turn around. His voice was strangely flat. "He said it was the perfect spot," James said. "Cold, quiet, and you can observe." He slowly raised his hand and pointed to the wall. Above the opening, he had nailed the mirror they had removed. He had fixed it and nailed it back, but this time facing the wall. He was here. He watched. And now, James took a deep breath, much like the damp sigh he had heard before. "It's my turn." Sarah saw what he was holding. It was the single bone button. She rushed at him, but he pushed her away. "I'm sorry. I have to be here. To protect." James slowly squeezed himself into the narrow opening. He entered the cavity. Sarah screamed, trying to pull him out, but he was strong. When he was fully hidden in the darkness, Sarah felt a cold draft hit her face. She saw movement. James's hand, slowly from the inside, began nailing the planks back. One by one, she heard the hammer blows muffled. Desperate, she tried to rip the planks out, but it was too late. The last plank was securely in place. Sarah and Timmy left Juneau that same night. They abandoned the house, abandoned their belongings. They left James in the wall. They never told anyone what happened. The Anderson house stood vacant for 2 more years before another family bought it. A family looking for a fresh start in Juno. It is said that the new owners complained about strange sounds and sudden temperature drops in the first floor hallway. Sometimes, walking down the corridor, they would feel a cold, narrow draft hitting the back of their necks, and if they listened closely, they could catch a quiet, dry chuckle coming from behind the wall. The laugh was long and exhalatory, as if someone was laughing with their face pressed against the concrete. But now it was louder, sometimes on the quietest nights. In the basement where the old mirror was boarded up, a faint, persistent tapping could be heard, tap, 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 as if someone was watching and waiting to be freed again. And if you look into the old, blackened mirror in the basement, which always reflected only the empty corner, you might notice that the reflection of the corner shimmers slightly, almost imperceptibly. Sometimes, in that shimmering, dew-covered reflection, a second button appears. Bone, dark brown. The man in the wall was waiting. But now there were two of them, and they were watching. The fourth story, Alaska. Not just a place on the map, but a state of perpetual dying. Here, winter is not a season, but a pathological state of reality. The sun, as if frightened by something ancient and unspeakably alien, abandons these lands for long months, leaving them to rot in crimson twilight and a bottomless, coal-black darkness that is not merely an absence of light, but something alive, dense and breathing. It was here on the Prometheus oil rig, lost in an icy void where even the radio signal from the mainland arrived as a distorted whisper, that Marcus worked. He was hired for huge money, which he now regretted with every cell of his tormented body. The seasonal affective disorder he had battled with varying success all his life here, in this eternal night, bloomed into a lush, poisonous flower of madness. The world had shrunk to the size of a metal cabin reeking of machine oil and fear, the roar of machinery like the death rattle of a giant beast, and the all-pervading cold that didn't just creep under the skin, it dug into the bones, the brain, the soul, freezing him from the inside out. The depression wasn't just sadness, it was a physical weight, a sensation that his body was slowly turning to stone and his consciousness was drowning in tar. But the worst were the shadows. Not the ones cast by objects, but others, moving at the very edge of vision, sliding in the periphery like spiders. Whispers in the ventilation that formed his name. Distinct footsteps in the absolutely empty corridor that fell silent the moment he dared to look out. The doctor on the mainland, after listening to him on the satellite phone, prescribed new pills and advised more light, as if light could save him from what waited in the dark. Light. It became his obsession, his religion, his only anchor in a reality growing more precarious by the day. At his disposal was a powerful spotlight installed on his section for night work. Marcus kept it on always, even when unnecessary, burning precious fuel. The blinding white beam, like a lightsaber, fiercely and helplessly sliced through the darkness, hitting an endless, impenetrable wall of night. It created a small island of safety around Marcus, a patch of illusory reality where one could still breathe without feeling the darkness pour into the lungs with the air. Marcus worked, ate, sometimes just stood under its rays, feeling them burn his retinas, searing away the creeping horror that clung to his heels, and whispered something soundless in a language that shouldn't exist. It was under this spotlight, his personal sun in hell, that it began. Quietly, insignificantly, like a seed of cancer. That evening, he was checking the frozen valves. His movements were slowed by chemical fatigue from the pills and the heaviness in his soul. Raising his hand to wipe his fogged glasses, he caught a discrepancy out of the corner of his eye, a tiny glitch in the matrix of being. His shadow on the frost, unnaturally sharp, black, like an abyss into nothingness, a hole in the fabric of the world, moved a fraction of a second before he did. Not in parallel, but before. He froze, his hand hanging in the air. His heart skipped a beat, stalled, then hammered with such fury that black dots danced in his temples. An eye glitch. He immediately tried to convince himself, swallowing a sticky, salty lump of panic. Fatigue, a hallucination, side effects. But the rationalizations turned to dust as soon as they were born. He deliberately repeated the movement, slowly, smoothly lowering his hand, watching the shadow with painful concentration. And again, the shadow reacted instantly, as if anticipating him, as if it were the puppeteer and he merely the marionette. It was a tiny, almost invisible lead, but it was enough for an icy trickle of animal, primal fear to pierce him through, from the crown of his head to his heels, locking his muscles. Marcus tried to ignore it. He returned to his cabin, took a double dose of sleeping pills, and fell into a heavy, unconscious sleep from which his own scream tore him. He dreamed he was standing under the spotlight, and his shadow, detached, came close to him and, having no face, watched him. And in that facelessness was a greater horror than in any monstrous visage. The next day it repeated, and the next. The shadow began to live its own life. It didn't just mimic his movements, it anticipated them, was their cause, not their effect. When he wanted to step, the shadow had already stepped. When he turned his head, the shadow was already looking that way, sometimes passing shiny surfaces. He saw his reflection linger, continuing to watch him with a cold, alien curiosity. The climax came on the evening when, exhausted, he leaned against an icy metal beam, trying to light a cigarette. His hands shook so badly, he couldn't catch the flame of the lighter. He stood motionless, staring into the darkness beyond his circle of salvational light, into the very darkness that now seemed to watch him with millions of invisible eyes. And then he saw it. His shadow, cast by the spotlight onto the snow, was still until he himself moved. It turned its head, slowly, with a faint crunching sound, as if vertebrae of ice were breaking. It looked around, studying the terrain he himself hadn't yet surveyed, its movement smooth, deliberate, intelligent. And only when the freezing terror peaked and Marcus, unable to bear it, convulsively jerked away, did the shadow smoothly, effortlessly, return to its rightful position, merging with his contour. But for a moment he thought its hand touched his heel, an icy, lifeless touch of void. After that, Marcus stopped sleeping. He turned on all the lights in his cabin, but they were dim, pathetic compared to his spotlight, and their light seemed dirty, sick. He went outside and stood under it for hours, like a moth flying into the flame that was about to kill it. He knew he was going insane, but this knowledge no longer brought relief, because madness was now the only explanation. He called his superiors, begged, sobbed into the receiver, demanding a helicopter, but due to a snowstorm that, like an evil fate, refused to abate, the evacuation was postponed indefinitely. His voice broke into a hysterical scream, but in response, he heard only calm, reasonable, so distant words. "Hang in there, Marcus. The storm will end soon." They didn't understand. The storm wasn't outside. The storm was inside him. He started keeping a video diary. Perhaps evidence of his madness would help him later, on the mainland, to prove that he hadn't cracked from mere loneliness, but from something real. Something that lived in this darkness and fed on the light of the human soul. The camera became his confessor, his only interlocutor. He recorded his paranoid monologues, his trembling hands, the empty corridors of the rig, on which he sometimes, upon review, noticed a dark spot quickly slipping around a corner. And then, that night arrived. The one. The storm raged with a special, almost personified fury. The wind howled with 1,000 voices, trying to tear the rig from its foundation, to drag it into oblivion. Marcus stood under the spotlight. He could fight no more. Fatigue was knocking him off his feet. His mind was strained to the limit. He looked at his shadow, which today was unnaturally sharp, black and thick, like liquid asphalt, despite the raging blizzard. It didn't sway in the wind. It was absolutely static and waiting. He turned on the camera mounted on a tripod. His face on the screen was grey, haggard, his eyes sunk into dark, bruise-like hollows, and stared out from the depths, with the silent horror of the doomed. "It's especially active today," he whispered, his voice hoarse and alien. "It's looking at me. I feel its gaze. Not the reflections, but it hates the light. Hates me for forcing it to be tied to me. It wants to leave, and I'm almost not stopping it." He fell silent, freezing, staring into the space before him, but seeing something beyond it. The recording shows his shadow on the wall behind him beginning to pulsate like a black heart of a monster. It grows thicker, denser, acquiring an unhealthy, oily sheen. And then, while Marcus himself stands, paralyzed with horror, unable to move a muscle, his shadow detaches from him. It wasn't a sharp jerk. It was a slow, agonizing process of peeling away, as if tearing off a piece of living flesh, a part of his own soul. The shadow tore away from his heels, pulling behind it a black, viscous, stringy substance resembling crude oil, and straightened up. It was his exact but flat, soulless copy, a void that had taken human form. It turned its faceless head towards Marcus, who stood with his mouth open in a silent scream, and lingered for a moment, as if saying goodbye, or appraising what it was leaving behind, and then it walked. Not left, but walked. Slowly, dragging its feet, with a terrifying, unnatural creak that was audible even over the howling wind, away from the spotlight into the embrace of the raging, living darkness. It took a few steps, and the darkness, as if having long awaited its child, absorbed it, soaked it up without a trace. The camera recorded for a few more minutes. Marcus still stood motionless, his face frozen in a mask of absolute, all-consuming terror, behind which there was nothing left. Then he slowly, very slowly, with difficulty, as if his limbs were made of cast iron, raised his head and looked directly into the lens. His eyes held no madness, no panic, not even despair, only emptiness, the same absolute cosmic emptiness that had walked into the night. He was a shell, a crypt. "It got lost," he whispered quietly, almost soundlessly, and his voice held not a trace of human emotion. "I'm alone now. It's so dark here." He took a step forward beyond the circle of light to where his shadow had just dissolved, and the darkness, like a predator, pounced on him and swallowed him without a trace. The rescuers who found the camera a week later never found Marcus's body. The recording held only his frozen face and the departing shadow. The official report stated, mental breakdown caused by extreme isolation. Presumed suicide. Psychiatrists wrote dissertations on hallucinations induced by the polar night. But the old workers in Alaska, those who had spent more than one winter in the dark and whose eyes had seen things not spoken of in civilized circles, know a different truth. They whisper around campfires that on the darkest nights one must beware not only of the cold polar bears and loneliness. One must beware one's own shadow, to watch it from the corner of the eye when no one is looking. Because sometimes the darkness is not just an absence of light. Sometimes it's something ancient, living, and hungry. And it watches you from within, from the very depths, and it has its own incomprehensible plans. And it can simply leave, leaving you an empty, cold shell, frozen under a bright, useless, mocking light, in an eternal wait for the day it might return, or bring others with it. The fifth story, Alaska, not a place on a map, but a state of consciousness. Fairbanks, not a city, but the last bastion before the abyss, where winter lasts 9 months a year and summer is just a brief, cruel joke. The air here is thick with frost and loneliness, and the nights are so black and dense it seems the stars in the sky are merely holes in a funeral shroud thrown over the world. It is here, on the very edge of this god-forsaken place, that the KFBR radio station stood, an old, peeling, blue-siding building, resembling a decaying tooth. It operated on a mysterious frequency, 87.9 FM, a band officially owned by no one, a phantom number on the radio dial. For decades it broadcast only one thing, monotonous hypnotic white noise. A steady, never-interrupted hiss like the breath of a sleeping giant. For the locals it was background, part of the soundscape. For Leo, a young, talented and unlucky DJ exiled here after a failed on-air prank at a major station in Miami, it was torture. Silence drove him crazy, and this noise was its evil, mocking sister. His shift ended at 4 in the morning. It was in this pre-dawn hour, when the blizzard outside buried the only road leading to the station, and the world beyond the walls turned into a white, howling void, that boredom and despair took over. Leo, against all instructions typed on an old typewriter and yellowed with age, decided to play with the ancient Collins 212 transmitter. This behemoth was older than his father and hummed like a hive of angry bees. He began twisting the tuning knobs, at first just out of boredom. At first nothing but the same steady hiss. Then, as the voltmeter needle trembled at the 87.9 mark, he thought he heard something. He froze, leaned closer to the speakers holding his breath. It was a whisper, not just a quiet sound. It was something viscous, wet, as if someone was speaking with their lips pressed against wet glass. Indistinguishable words muttered under one's breath, but with a strange, sinister rhythm. Leo pulled back, blaming it on fatigue and imagination. He turned off the equipment and drove home, but the whisper haunted him in the engine's hum and the wind's howl. The next night, he couldn't resist. The whisper was louder. It didn't come over the white noise, but through it, born from its very core, like a worm from a rotten apple. Leo noticed something strange. The needles on the transmitter's measuring instruments began to tremble finely when the whisper intensified, even though the signal power remained the same. It was impossible. Obsession was born instantly, like a flash of illness. Leo connected an old Panasonic cassette recorder to the transmitter's output and began recording the broadcasts. Every night, he sat in his studio, locked in a cocoon of blizzard and darkness, and recorded hours of this nightmare. He felt like an alchemist trying to extract meaning from chaos. At home in his tiny, mold-smelling apartment, he played the tapes, listening until he saw bloodshot spots in his eyes, trying to make out the words. He started hearing the whisper even in complete silence. It sounded in the rhythm of his own heartbeat. A week passed, and then, one dull morning over a cup of cold coffee, listening to another tape on worn-out headphones, he finally understood. It wasn't incoherent whispering. They were instructions. Slow, methodical, spoken in a lifeless metallic voice, they described a route. Not just a road, but something more. Turn left at the burnt alder, its trunk split by lightning in the shape of a snake. Walk exactly 317 steps along the old deer trail, counting your breaths. Stop at the stone where a face appears when the moon shines at a 45-degree angle. Circle frozen Lake Nurda from the north. Do not look at the reflection in the water. It was a path through the most desolate, wild, and anomalous places in Alaska. A path leading straight to the KFBR radio station. The voice didn't just describe the road. It knew it in the smallest unnatural details. Leo felt an icy worm of fear crawl down his spine and settle at the base of his skull. He turned off the recorder. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped his cup. Was it someone's cruel joke? But who could whisper this into the dead frequencies broadcast for weeks with terrifying precision? And how did this someone know about the stone with the face, which wasn't in any guidebook? The next recording, made 2 nights later, held a new surprise that finally broke him. First came the same instructions, ending at the foot of the hill where the station stood. Then a pause. The white noise grew louder, thicker, pressing on his eardrums like a physical substance. and through it, clear and distinct, came his name. Leo. The voice was the same, lifeless, whispering, but there was a drop of something new in it. Not just impatience, it was familiarity, ownership. Then followed a phrase that made his blood run cold and filled him with an absolute paralyzing certainty that he was not alone in the room. "You are so close. I am waiting." On the air, it didn't just hear his name. It knew Leo was listening. It knew Leo was there in the building at the end of that route. And the most terrible thing, it knew it was waiting on the air. Not in the studio, not in the building, but precisely on the air. The panic was blind, animal, and all-consuming. Leo yanked the cassette from the recorder, then another and another. He burned them in an old, rusty barrel behind the station, watching with disgust as the plastic melted and the magnetic tape writhed in the fire, emitting a thin, high-pitched squeal, as if in agony. He thought he heard that very whisper in the crackle of the flames. The next morning he burst into his boss's office, pale, with shaking hands and wild eyes, and quit without explanation. He was sure he had burned not only the recordings, but the nightmare itself. As he left, glancing back at the KFBR building, he thought he saw a pale, faceless shadow flicker for a moment in one of the dark upstairs windows. He left Fairbanks, first to Anchorage, then to Seattle, and finally all the way to the East Coast, to noisy, insane New York. He found a job at a trendy radio station, surrounded himself with people, lights, the sounds of the big city. He tried to run, to drown out the past. He changed his phone number, deleted social media, started a new life. But it found him. It traveled with him like a stowaway in his own mind. The first time it happened was in the subway. The screech of the train, the hum of hundreds of voices, music from headphones, and suddenly, for a split second, it all gave way to the familiar, hated white noise. Pure crystalline, like in that studio in Alaska. It didn't feel like a mere memory. It was a physical sensation, as if his ears had suddenly been cleared, and he could hear the true sound of the world hidden beneath the layer of city noise. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, shook his head, and the sound vanished. My imagination, he tried to convince himself, but his palms were damp with cold sweat. Then, standing in the shower through the sound of the water, he heard it again. A quiet but persistent hiss, as if someone in his head was slowly, with static interference, tuning a receiver to the right wavelength. This became his new, nightmarish reality. Wherever he was, at a noisy party in a quiet library, at a therapy session, at the most inopportune moment, the external sounds would suddenly retune. They weren't drowned out, but seemed to be filtered, distorted, giving way to the growing white noise, which became louder and clearer each time. It was as if a radio receiver was built into his brain, and an unknown hand was slowly, relentlessly turning the tuning knob, searching for that very frequency, 87.9 FM. He began to fear silence, because in the silence, he heard the preliminary hiss heralding an imminent broadcast, and with the noise came the whisper. It no longer gave instructions. Now it simply spoke to Leo, and it spoke more and more articulately. "You ran." That was cute, but the distance on the air is zero. I am still here. I'm always here. In the space between the stations. You are my receiver, Leo. My only and most sensitive receiver. We are tuned to the same wavelength. The doctor shrugged. Psychiatrists diagnosed acute psychosis, a complex form of panic disorder with elements of Cotard's syndrome. Medication helped only partially, dampening the anxiety but unable to silence the signal. He stopped leaving the house, disconnected all radios and TVs in his apartment, soundproofed the windows, wore earplugs. But it didn't help. The transmitter wasn't outside. It was inside, in his head. The whisper became so loud he began to discern new details in it, a slight echo, as if the voice was sounding in a vast, empty space, and a barely audible background noise like a slow, rhythmic scraping. Now Leo sits in his room in Brooklyn, in the heart of a city of millions that never sleeps, pressing his palms to his ears, rocking back and forth. But he knows it's useless. He hears the familiar hiss growing in his skull. Soon the white noise will become deafening, burning away all other thoughts. Soon the whisper will come, and he knows the most terrible final truth, which he himself deduced listening to those recordings. He didn't run from it. He didn't burn it. He brought it with him. He is a living, breathing, suffering antenna for something ancient and hungry that waited its turn in the silence between frequencies, in the dead zone's broadcast. And one day, very soon, the tuning will be complete. The signal will become perfectly clear, and the whisper will cease to be a whisper, and he will learn what has been waiting for him all this time on the other end of the wave. Not in the radio station building, but within himself. And the door he opened by twisting the tuning knobs that night can no longer be closed. It leads not out but in, and something on the other side has long since learned to speak in his voice. The sixth story. Denali National Park is not just a nature reserve with scenic views. It is an ancient, breathing entity whose lungs are endless coniferous forests, and whose heart is mountain peaks covered in eternal snow, beating to a rhythm inaccessible to human hearing. Here time flowed differently, obeying not the leisurely march of clocks, but the age-old cycles of birth and decay. The laws here were written not by man, but by nature itself, and they were carved not in official codes, but in instincts, in the memory of ancestors, in the patterns of frost on stones, and in the depths of bears' eyes. Anna was not just a ranger. She was part of this ancient organism, its blood and nerve endings. She had spent her entire conscious life in Denali, with more than a dozen hiking seasons behind her. She knew every stream whose babble could point the way to camp, every bear trail worn through the thick grass, every creaky cedar under whose shade one could shelter from a sudden storm. She taught tourists the simple, clear rules, written in the blood of those who had broken them. Don't leave food, it will attract a bear. Don't leave the trail. The tundra does not forgive mistakes. Don't look a wolf or a grizzly in the eye. It's a challenge they will answer. But there was one more law, an ancient one, passed on in a whisper, not included in any official booklet or mentioned on any instructional sign. She had heard it from an old native guide named Joseph, whose face was like the dried-up bed of a mountain river, etched with wrinkle streams. One evening by the campfire, watching the dancing flames reflected in his dark, bottomless eyes, he said to her in a voice that creaked with ancient ice, "Remember, girl, the most important law of the tundra, the one older than all these mountains. Never pick up what lies on the ground if it is perfectly whole. Nature creates nothing perfect here. A broken branch, a gnawed bone, a stone with a chip, that's normal. That's life. But anything that is whole and untouched by time, the elements or beast, that is not a gift. It's a trap. It is not lost. It is waiting for its hour." Anna had nodded then, treating it as a local superstition, a colorful but empty campfire tale meant to keep the overly curious visitors in check. The law about food and bears seemed far more real and tangible to her. She smiled, thanked the old man, and forgot about this warning as one forgets a dream by noon. And so, on one of those late autumn days when the sun was liquid and cold, like molten tin on a leaden sky, and the air rang with the anticipation of the first real blizzard, Anna was patrolling a remote, almost forgotten section of the park, the Valley of Silent Winds. A tourist's foot rarely stepped there, and even the rangers themselves showed up no more than once a season. The place had a bad reputation. People disappeared here, and those who returned spoke of an inexplicable melancholy that washed over them amidst the perfectly beautiful landscape. Her dog, a faithful white husky named Barry, usually tireless and cheerful, was behaving strangely today. She wasn't running ahead, but behind, her head hung low, and only occasionally, reluctantly, sniffed at tracks. Suddenly Barry froze, rooted to the spot. All her muscles tensed, the fur on her scruff stood on end, baring her teeth, and a low, vibrating growl, full of such primal hatred and fear that Anna had never heard anything like it from her pet, erupted from her throat. The dog stared at a single point in the middle of an absolutely flat, untouched snowfield whose whiteness hurt the eyes. Anna followed her gaze, squinting in the bright light, and her heart skipped a beat for a moment. In the middle of this snowy silence, where by all laws of geology and logic there should have been nothing but snowdrifts, lay a stone. It was small, the size of her fist, but its presence felt enormous, overwhelming. It was perfect, absolutely smooth, polished to a mirror-like, almost metallic shine, without a single crack, scratch, or dent. A deep raven-black color that seemed not just to absorb sunlight but to draw it in, creating a slight shimmering haze that distorted the air around it. It lay on the snowy blanket like an alien artifact or a jewel forgotten by a giant. Joseph's law echoed in her head like a loud alarm bell. Never pick up. But curiosity, that very flaw that had doomed more than one person, had already sunk its hooks into her brain. Rationality, drilled into her by years of work, immediately spoke up. It's just a stone, an unusual basalt, polished by a glacier, a unique geological specimen, a beautiful souvenir. Quiet, Barry, calm down, she said. But the dog didn't relent, continuing to growl, backing away and leaving grooves in the snow with her claws. Anna took a step forward, then another. The frosty air suddenly seemed thick as syrup to her. She bent down, reached out her thickly gloved hand and picked it up. The stone was surprisingly, unnaturally heavy, as if she had lifted not a small rock, but an entire granite boulder. And the cold. It was icy, much colder than the surrounding air. This cold didn't just nip at the skin, it penetrated through the glove, through the flesh, right into the bone, carrying with it a strange, viscous sensation of emptiness. Barry howled, long, mournful, almost human-like, turned around and fled into the forest without looking back. "Barry, stop!" Anna shouted, but the dog didn't obey. For the first time in all the years, with an uneasy feeling in her soul, but still not releasing the stone from her hand, Anna trudged back to her cabin. On the way, it seemed to her that the trees on either side of the trail leaned lower, as if recoiling from her and her burden. The wind, usually vocal in these parts, died down, and a oppressive dead silence fell. In her cozy cabin, smelling of smoke, pine needles, and leather, she placed the stone on the massive wooden table that served as both her desk and dining table. She lit the fireplace, but the familiar heat couldn't seem to drive away the penetrating cold emanating from the stone. And then, while making dinner, she felt it for the first time, an alien gaze. Sharp, intent, mercilessly analytical, devoid of any warmth or curiosity. The gaze of a predator studying its prey. She spun around sharply, her heart pounding in her chest, expecting to see the face of a bear or a lynx in the single window. But outside the glass, only the thick, impenetrable, living darkness of the Alaskan night was gathering. The gaze didn't come from outside. It came from inside the room, directly from the table. She walked over and stared at the stone. It lay motionless, black and silent, but it seemed to her that it wasn't just lying on the table. It was occupying the table, taking its place, and now it was watching. A mute, perfect pupil, absorbing not light, but the very atmosphere of the home, its warmth, its history. The night passed restlessly. Anna had strange dreams. She was wandering across an endless snowy plain, and black, perfectly round stones were falling from the sky, and each one, landing beside her, swallowed a piece of her memory. She woke up with a heavy head and a feeling of inexplicable loss. The morning began with a nightmare more terrifying than any dream. She called Barry for breakfast, The dog approached reluctantly, wagging its tail but with its head down and not looking her in the eye. Anna opened her mouth to say her name and felt icy horror. There was emptiness in her head, a clean, bleached sheet. She looked at the faithful dog, at its intelligent, now sorrowful eyes, at the familiar white fur, and couldn't remember its name. A lump rose in her throat, choking her. She frantically went through the names she had given dogs over the years. Buddy, Loki, Rex, Sam. None resonated in her memory. None suited this creature. In panic, she grabbed the collar. The tag was engraved with Barry. The relief was brief and immediately replaced by a chilling, all-consuming terror. She had forgotten her dog's name. The dog that had been with her for 7 years, slept at her feet, shared all the hardships and joys with her. That was only the beginning. The beginning of the end. The stone stood on the table, silent and heavy, and its cold was now felt throughout the cabin despite the stove being red hot. And Anna was becoming lighter. First, the names left her. Colleagues, friends from the nearest settlement, her boss. She picked up the radio to make contact and couldn't remember the call signs. Then the faces began to fade. She found a photograph of her mother on a shelf, taken at her graduation. She looked at the smiling young woman with her own eyes, and the features of her face blurred, melted away like patterns on fogged glass. She remembered the abstract concept of mom, but couldn't recall what she exactly looked like, what her voice sounded like, how her perfume smelled. Memories began to disappear like puddles on hot asphalt. Her first hike, her first love, her first kiss. All of it turned into faded, silent pictures, devoid of emotions and smells, and then crumbled into dust altogether. She tried to write down the most important things in a notebook, but rereading the lines, she couldn't remember the context, the sensations behind the words. They were just ink on paper. She finally connected it to the stone. Too many coincidences. Every time she passed the table, a cold shiver ran through her to the bone, and a white haze flashed in her head, taking with it another fragment of the past. She tried to throw it away. Once, gathering all her willpower, she took the stone to carry it far into the forest. But she couldn't. Not physically, it seemed to have grown attached to her hand, and such a whirlwind of panic and pain rose in her head that she, sobbing, returned it to the table. The stone was not just an object. It was a parasite that had burrowed into her life. Now it didn't just lie, it owned the cabin. The wood of the table beneath it had darkened and become covered with frost. The air around it was icy and thick. Anna began to notice something new. Sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, it seemed that the stone was not perfectly round, but had a protrusion resembling a head, or a depression resembling a mouth. The illusion lasted for a fraction of a second, but it chilled her to the bone. One night she woke up with a feeling of absolute, all-consuming emptiness. She lay in bed and couldn't remember who she was. Her name, her profession, her age, her past, everything was washed away like drawings in the sand by a mighty tide. In her head, there was only a white, silent, endless whirlwind. The only reality, the only anchor in this advancing nothingness, was the crushing, all-pervading cold emanating from the table. The cold from the black, perfect, insatiable stone. She got up and walked over to it, moving like a sleepwalker, her body light, almost weightless. She reached out her hand to touch it and realized that this was the only thing she now remembered. Its cold, its weight, its perfect soulless form. She had forgotten what love was, fear, joy. She had forgotten what it meant to be human. Anna was becoming lighter every day. She barely ate, barely slept, turning into a transparent shadow. Her memories, her personality, herself, all of it was being absorbed by the stone, becoming part of its mute, cold, eternal mass. She was like a snowflake, beautiful, intricate, but ready to melt at the slightest breath and disappear without a trace, leaving neither memory nor regret. She no longer tried to fight. She sat in her chair, looking out the window at the majestic, snow-covered peaks of Denali, which she had once loved so madly, and didn't remember their names, didn't feel the former awe. Barry, her faithful dog, had long since run away into the forest, unable to bear what his mistress had become, and the smell of deathly cold that had replaced the familiar scent of home. The last coherent memory, which slowly slid from her consciousness like the last drop of water from an overturned bowl, was the face of old Joseph, illuminated by the campfire, and his words, which had now become prophetic. It is not lost. It is waiting for its hour. Now, in the cabin, in the chair by the extinguished fireplace, sat an empty shell, light, almost weightless, breathing so rarely and quietly that the movement of her chest was almost imperceptible. Her eyes were open, but there was no thought, no awareness in them, only the reflection of the window frame and the white light outside. And on the table lay the stone. It was still perfectly smooth, glossy, and black. But if someone with sharp eyesight and strong nerves were to look at it very carefully, they might think that in its depths, in the very heart of the blackness, a shadow flickered for a moment, a vague but recognizable image, the reflection of a smiling woman's face, Anna's face, as it was before that fateful day in the Valley of Silent Winds. A face that it had once taken, absorbed, and now kept in its cold, stony, eternal memory. It had waited, and it had succeeded, and now it was ready to wait again until the next victim broke the ancient law of the tundra,